I'm Peter Johnson and I purchased Heron Lodge in Farndon, Cheshire as my retirement home in 2000. Since that time I've been engaged in two major battles. The first one against the fear of severe flooding to my property. The second, a major one, with Cheshire West and Chester Council, formerly known as Chester City Council. Built in the 1920s, the cottage, named then as Heron's Flight, was a two-bedroom, 1.5-storey bungalow situated on the banks of the River Dee. Due to its location in the Lower Dee floodplain, the property was prone to flooding. After extensive research of its deeds and of previous owners, I finally purchased the bungalow on the 1st of March 2000 and renamed it Heron Lodge. After renovating the inside, I finally moved in on the 1st of July 2000. My plan was to extend the bungalow to 3 bedrooms and in the extensive gardens install a hobby room, study and 2 holiday-type pine lodges. Dave Cowell, the planning officer for Chester City Council, was positive on all counts, but advised that building regulations would be required for the extension. The hobby room and pine lodges were exempt due to their portable structure, but that an area of garden would require a change of use application. We also discussed flood defence work, as part of the garden was waterlogged, which I assumed was from previous flooding. Dave Cowell advised that Chester City Council didn't control that and I would have to contact the Environment Agency North Wales Flood Defence Office to obtain their advice and permission. The Environment Agency sent along a manager and an engineer to survey the garden and gave positive advice and permission to proceed. I had formulated a plan to achieve complete flood defence and cure the waterlogging at the same time. During the survey, they expressed astonishment at the height of the land directly adjacent to mine. It was some 2.75 metres above my garden level. In their view, that had exceeded its permission of development and it would be reported, also adding that it was the most likely cause of the waterlogging of my garden. They went on to say that it had affected the entire water table of the surrounding land, even the public right-of-way footpath. I have made 3 attempts to obtain a copy of the plans for the fish farm, but was always rejected, receiving various excuses to their non-availability. Some earlier photographs show the rear garden before the fish farm and whilst their work was conducted. The extent of the waterlogging can be seen also in some of the photographs. It was in early April that a very rude Mr. Leslie Smith arrived demanding to know what I was doing. He informed me in an officious tone that he was the planning enforcement team leader for Chester and I couldn't reside in my home because it wasn't a dwelling, that it was only occupiable for 7 months as a holiday chalet and that it had no development rights and therefore I couldn't do any work to it. Despite informing him of Dave Cowell's former advice and the involvement and permissions of the Environment Agency, he wouldn't listen. He stated in his officious tone again that any work to my home would bring about injunctive action to stop and reverse it. Further, that although he had 47 other cases, he would be watching me. I felt shock and amazement and a feeling of total anxiety that I had never experienced before. I continued with the various aspects of the work, realising all the time in the back of my mind that flooding was a significant threat from October onwards. I consulted with the vendor's solicitors and mine, obtaining copies of various supporting documents should they be called on by the new attack-like regime of Chester City Council. Advice on the worthiness of team leader Les Smith's arguments was also considered. By May, Chester Council served a planning contravention notice, alleging an infringement of using the property as a dwelling and threatening fines of £5,000. I called for a meeting at Chester where I hoped to present the advice of the Environment Agency, copies of the deeds, a solicitor's letter in support and previous owners' statutory declarations of residence. Dave Cowell's presence at the meeting was excused by Leslie Smith, stating that he alone was available and was dealing with the matter. No response came from that meeting, and as an unacceptable situation prevailed, I chose to write to the Chief Executive Officer, Paul Durham. Needless to say, that was not responded to. During the rest of the summer, I carried on with my planned ideas in readiness to at least get the structure up to the recommended and permitted height to prevent it from flooding. Suddenly in August, a second planning contravention notice was served by Smith, repeating the first one's allegation of residency infringement. But now I was also accused of installing a residential caravan on agricultural ground and a wooden building without planning permission. The caravan was in fact my small Bailey Tourer with my vehicle licence plate mounted on it, and the building was a large garden shed which I had previously moved from the northern end of the garden to the southern end to help me store building materials. He again repeated his threat of injunctive action if I carried out any more of the flood defence work, as by then I was fully prepared to at least raise the structure to the recommended defended level. By September, my solicitors had considered the overall position and advised me not to ignore Chester Council and stop the work, submit a planning application for residential lawful use, along with the flood defence work, and installing the sewage treatment plant within the curtilage in the hope of placating these officious planners. By the time all of that paperwork was submitted in October, the first of 3 monstrous floods stretching over a 9-week period, the worst on record, arrived, completely devastating my entire property. I lost everything. The whole of the inside renovations were totally destroyed. I was reduced to living in my small touring caravan, and that lasted for over 40 months. By the end of 2000, Chester Council refused to grant a residential use certificate, breaching a 1978 law precedent, and by the spring of 2001, the council had found numerous reasons for not attending to the other parts of the application. I was distraught and totally anxious about getting my home back and livable. I decided to carry on with the work of creating the flood defence and effecting complete renovation of the inside all over again. Despite frequent calls to the council, they persisted with delaying tactics. By now I was incensed and chose to carry on, not realising the cause of the troubles that had beset me, more concerned with bringing my dream to reality and getting through this nightmare. During the raising of the building on ground level, I installed the eco-friendly and compliant sewage treatment plant and a self-designed eco-friendly rainwater harvesting system. Both installations were part of and integral to the new home structure and its flood defences, and totally necessary as there were no services in the approach road to my home. The previous sewage septic tank system was totally unhealthy as it discharged at times of flooding, and that was unacceptable to me. 11 months later, in September 2001, Chester Council's Laura Smith, a planning officer, finally served the planning permission document, which was by then retrospective. What a ludicrous situation, most especially when I discovered a footnote in the small print which stated that they had only given permission to raise the building and not the land. Yet another meeting took place and Laura Smith admitted that they had made a mistake and thought it meant just the building, despite them sitting on copies of the Environment Agency permission document and specification of the flood defence work. Most certainly not a mistake, but what was really going on? I thought that after the meeting they would correct the mistake. They didn't. Instead, over the next 9 months, went on to serve 2 enforcement notices, requiring all of the flood defence work to be removed. By early 2003, my battle against flooding as a result of my flood defence work was won. I had also received the Environment Agency approval of the work. It was now easy to get in and get out during the flooding, and I was safe at last, although still in my temporary home. But little did I know the major battle with Chester Council had only just got started. An appeal of the first of the ridiculous enforcement notices was won, and was referred back along with the second enforcement notice to the Planning Inspectorate for reconsideration. But then the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister, boss of Her Majesty's Government Department that gave permission for and approval of the flood defence work, was now conducting a 6-day public inquiry through his other department, the Planning Inspectorate. This resulted in a ruling that I had to comply and reverse all of the flood defence work. After some 10 visits to the High Court in London, the judge's final statement ruled out any further approaches due to now being out of time. By now all of my cash had gone on solicitors and redoing the work to my home. I had to fight on a loan. The results of this ruling were not just shocking but totally bizarre. It meant that I had to destroy the flood defence, destroy the sewage treatment plant, destroy the rainwater harvesting system, and in effect make the building unlawful, as it would not meet the stringent building regulations governing access, and mean that in effect I couldn't live in it. Was this Chester's endgame all along? As the courts repeatedly knocked back my own attempted appeals and finally awarded an injunction for Chester against me, I undertook extensive research and found that Chester had firstly committed 3 criminal acts of perverting the course of justice during the public inquiry. Secondly, the Planning Inspectorate had ignored my evidence of those crimes, which should have resulted in the inquiry being nullified. Thirdly, the Chester planners and executives and solicitors had clearly breached their professional ethics and oaths in performing those criminal acts. The Office of the Deputy Prime Minister had breached the House of Lords ruling in appointing an unqualified person to chair the public inquiry. Thereby that rendered the decision of the chairs as totally nullified and the injunction inapplicable, unenforceable, and thereby nullified the whole of the injunction. 2 further inspectors' decisions which rely on authority and qualification of the failed chair's decision are thereby nullified. Finally, the Chester Authority has deliberately and falsely maintained an illegal position regarding denial of my property's residential status, and the Planning Inspectorate has been complicit in that. The permissions of the fish farm have been totally breached. The finished level of their work should have been 1 inch below my old ground level and not 2 3/4 metres above it. That in spite of the Environment Agency warnings of the effects on Heron Lodge. It had gone ahead and displaced 1.640 million cubic feet of water from the floodplain capacity. Those last 2 items alone mean that Chester has behaved with gross incompetence and failed to observe its duty of care to my property. The Town and Country Planning Act, Section 55, paragraph 3b, 1 to 3, allowed my work without the need for planning consent, which actually meant that the issuing of the enforcement notices by Chester were in breach of planning law, and that I had no need to approach the Environment Agency in the first instance. A recent 2011 Freedom of Information request that I made on Chester has revealed that Chester Council have infringed the 1997 HM Government Enforcement Protocol and confirmed that the 2 planning contravention notices and the 2 enforcement notices should not have been issued at all. The latest move by Chester is to gain possession of my home under a court order for sale to meet their now proven erroneous costs orders, which are by implication contrived and therefore illegal. I believe they think they're above the law in this contrived plan and are rushing to secure the end as their get out of jail free card.